and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and time travelers. I'm Andrew Heaton, and today we're going to talk about homelessness. But I want to show you something before we get into all of that. Here, hop in my time-traveling 13-foot fiberglass camper. We're going to journey back to Elizabethan England. Trust me, this is all pertinent to the program. Okay, here we are, in 1600 England. If you talk to a local, you will soon discover just how wildly, dangerously overpopulated everybody thinks it is. Now to us, living in the future as we do, what with our air conditioning and polio vaccines and a magical rectangle you can listen to me through while driving in your horseless carriage, overpopulation of 16th century England sounds quaint, if not absurd. There are 56 million people bumping around England in 2022, all drinking tea and sweeping chimneys or whatever English people do. In 1600, there are a mere 4 million people in England, just 4 million people. In our time, 2022, the population density of England is over 1,000 people per square mile. In 1561, the average density is less than 60. And yet, all these witch-hanging bumpkins think their country is dangerously overpopulated. Comical. Silly old English people thinking their island was overcrowded. Or is it silly? Let's consider England's massive, crazy, unprecedented population explosion of 4 million people in terms of pace. In 1520, there are only 2 million people in England. By 1600, there are 4 million people. The population doubles in just 3 generations. In 1558, London has a population of roughly 70,000 people. In 1603, the number is 200,000. So in a sense, these quaint, old-timey Elizabethans with their stupid bloodlettings and ridiculous lute music actually have a point. Because while there's plenty of space in Britain, there's not enough housing. Towns simply cannot keep up with the explosive population growth they're experiencing. Plenty of fields, not enough shacks. And there's an additional problem confounding overpopulation. Sheep. England is filling up with sheep. Now, sheep aren't villainous in and of themselves. They're cute and delicious, and you can build sweaters out of them. Previously, most of the English population is dirt-poor farmers who eke out just enough to avoid starvation and to pay rent for their land. As England becomes a global wool exporter, landlords realize the pittance their tenant farmers pay is far less lucrative than the sheep trade, so they evict everyone and replace them with sheep. These already poor people, who are now poor and evicted, have nowhere to go but cities. In 1380, the vast majority of the English population is rural. Only about 13% of people live in a town, let alone a city. By 1600, a quarter of the English population is urban. So we have an expanding population, which is not expanding evenly. Cities have to scramble to build houses for new babies, but also this influx of dumbstruck country peasants. And we have another problem. Sheep. Sheep again! Timber is already frightfully expensive due to all the ships the English had to make to fend off French and Spanish invasions. But forests are also less lucrative than the sheep trade. So landlords are selling their wood to make room for more sheep. As the supply of timber declines, the price of wood rises, which makes tenement construction all the more expensive. So to bring everyone up to snuff, here in Elizabethan England, we have an exploding population who we are evicting in favor of sheep farms. There are not enough houses, and we're making housing construction more expensive by chopping down trees to grow more sheep. Parliament passes laws to outlaw unnecessary uses of timber. I don't know what that means. I guess statues or bookshelves or paperweights. I don't know. Either way, it's just a Band-Aid. The landscape is flooded with a decrepit army of paupers. These half-starved beggars frighten townsfolk who step over them on the streets, and they alternately pester, terrify, or burgle country folk who must pass them by as they vagabond half-starved on the roads. But don't worry, because in 1530, Parliament springs into action by banning gypsies. The idea being that gypsies, which the English call Egyptians, hence the name, only make a living through palm reading, thieving, and fortune-telling. So they're booted out. However, it turns out the vast majority of the impoverished and itinerant in England are not Roma fortune-tellers. So in 1572, England comes up with a comprehensive solution to poverty. Ban it. England tries to solve poverty by banning poverty. Parliament passes an Act for the Punishment of Vagabonds for the Relief of the Poor and the Impotent. The idea being that the main problem with poverty and overpopulation is that these roaming peasants simply refuse to quit being poor and homeless. If these dirty vagabonds would just get a job and a house, we wouldn't have all these poor, thieving homeless people cluttering the roads now, would we? But you have to understand, the English are idiots. The people running the government don't grok the root cause of overpopulation and overcrowding. They think it's because the Tudors started letting priests marry, which to double the population would require very horny priests. Priests with sex drive so astonishing you could use them to power water wheels. The English haven't even worked out supply and demand yet. They literally think all these skeletal wretches clogging the roads and gutters are there because they prefer that lifestyle of immiserate poverty. It doesn't really occur to the powers that be or respectable middle-class burghers that the reason the homeless vagabonds won't get jobs and houses is not because they like doing that, it's because there are no houses or jobs for them to obtain. Which partially explains why the act to effectively ban poverty is so incredibly mean-spirited. It mandates that a vagabond above the age of 14 years shall be grievously whipped and burned through the gristle of the right ear with a hot iron of the compass of an inch unless some credible person takes him into service for a year. If they caught a teenager panhandling on the road, they'd whip him and shove a hot iron through his ear. And if that same kid got caught vagabonding again when he turned 18, they'd hang him. Well, you were already warned about being poor and itinerant. England's tough on crime. 2 strikes and you're out. Them's the cricket rules, poppers. And if you're thinking, wow, that's pretty stupid. Surely, this must be the apogee of English governmental stupidity. I mean, what could possibly be dumber than trying to fix homelessness by outlawing it and disfiguring teenagers? Well, stay tuned, guys, because in 1589, Parliament prohibits anyone from giving accommodation to homeless people. It's illegal to be homeless, and it's also illegal to let an otherwise homeless person live with you. By law, in England, there can only be 1 family per household. In 1600, the town of Malsham in Essex prosecutes 8 tenants for sheltering poor people, mostly couples, some of them old. The paupers are evicted, and the people who dared provide them shelter are fined. The logic in Malsham is, eventually, England inches towards sanity. Poor will come to Malsham, realizes that you can't fix poverty by banning it, so they go the more progressive route and begin issuing begging licenses. All right. Finally, in 1597, Parliament passes an Act for the Relief of the Poor, which is foundational to the modern British welfare state. Henceforth, rather than whipping, disfiguring, and executing homeless itinerants, the government will appoint an overseer in each parish to create work for paupers and assign destitute children apprenticeships. And, very importantly, this is to be financed by a tax. Care of the poor is no longer through churches and alms. It is now a public, societal responsibility. Things are on a positive trajectory from there on out, though not yet fixed. All right, that's about all I wanted to show you here in old-timey England. Now listen, I know what you're thinking. Your last name's Heaton, isn't it? That sounds English. Painfully English. Can we go meet your relatives of this era and make them give us dinner? Yeah, I thought about that. Turns out Heaton means high place, literally Heath Town or Hill Town, which sounds really uppity and snooty until you realize it's just Old English for hillbilly, as in, oh crap, here come the hill people. Oh crap, here come the hill people. And they have war sheep. Let's get out of here. I apologize. I Got in such a hurry to escape my 16th century sheep-wielding relatives that I put in the wrong coordinates. We're back in America, but only so far as 19th century New England. You know what, though? I actually want to show you something here before we move on. You see that ugly-looking seat? That's a tramp chair. It's a very uncomfortable iron chair. All those protruding bolts and rivets make it painful to sit on. And if you leave it outside, it gets very hot or very cold, depending on the elements. When a panhandler passes through this town here in 19th century New England, the police will strap him to that tramp chair, then leave him locked in it for a couple of days. 5 minutes in a tramp chair, not so bad. Uncomfortable, but not so bad. 2 hours, very bad. 2 days, literal torture. Just straight up, unabashed torture. Then when they finally release him, they're going to shout, "Don't come back through this town," which is this era's solution to homelessness in large part. Much like Molsham's, their solution to homelessness is just not to have to look at it. Let somebody else figure it out.
Hey, you there!
Uh-oh. Looks like one of my 19th century New England relatives spotted us. And he's got a guard sheep. Let's get out of here. Whew. Okay, we're back in 2022, where we can smugly look back at our contemptible, mean-spirited forebears and think, we are so much smarter and kinder than all you idiot Elizabethans and Georgians. Or can we? I want you to imagine that as we catch our breath here in enlightened 2022, some plucky podcast host from the distant future materializes along with a time-traveling companion who supports his adventure on Patreon by going to the futuristic version of patreon.com/Andrew Heaton, which in the future is probably holographic. Anyway, they're visiting us in our time from the year 2600. There they are, standing in their absurd silver jumpsuits with their much thinner iPhone and robot teeth, and they say, "Great Hubbard! Look at all these homeless people in the year 2022. What were you idiots thinking? Why haven't you solved this yet? There are 80,000 homeless people in Los Angeles alone. You morons have played golf on the moon, but you still haven't resolved homelessness?" Because we are also idiots. Mind you, we're still much, much better than the Elizabethans. I would vastly prefer homelessness in contemporary Los Angeles to old-timey Grimswhittle upon Carbuncle, where they punch holes in teenage earlobes, but all the same, isn't it weird, nay horrible, that there are so many homeless people around today? If there's one basic social safety net issue we ought to have fixed, if we're going to have a public social safety net at all, the core of it should be that nobody has to sleep in a bag on top of asphalt under a bridge. If homelessness didn't exist, and we suddenly encountered a homeless person on the street, we would be shocked. We would drop everything to help them. We'd cancel our appointments and feed them and drive them over to government services or put them up on our couch, because we would recognize on some visceral level how messed up that is. The profound mismatch of people standing in line to watch a Jimmy Buffett tribute band next to people sleeping in dumpsters. But when it's widespread and commonplace, as it is now, we become inured to it. We just shrug and move on. So this week, on The Political Orphanage, we're going to explore ways to alleviate homelessness, which I think ought to be front and center in terms of problems we as a society wish to solve. I would put homelessness well ahead of, say, vitamin D deficiency. And I'll level with you. This is a massively complex issue. There's no single one cause of homelessness. There's no single solution to homelessness. Homelessness exists at the intersection of multiple broken systems. I've been working on this episode off and on for over a year now. I've not only been reading think tank literature and HUD reports, I also regularly volunteered underneath a bridge downtown for several months because I wanted to help, but also because I wanted to get to know our down-and-out neighbors personally, rather than understanding them through statistics. Because this issue is so complex, we're not going to be able to cover every cause or solution to it today. Here's what we're going to do instead. We're going to use Elizabethan England, with all their stark economic illiteracy and outright cruelty, as a lodestone, or I guess an anti-lodestone. We aren't going to solve all homelessness on today's episode, but we are going to find ways that we ourselves can be less stupid and less cruel. By the end of today's episode, we will identify the dumb, nasty things our own contemporary society keeps doing, which causes and exacerbates a phenomenon no one should be forced to suffer through. Before we jump in, can we all make one agreement? You and I, and everybody listening, we're going to make a pact here. First, this is an important issue. No one should ever step over a prone, destitute figure on an American sidewalk. And no American should be sleeping on it. This is something worth fixing. Second, let's all agree anyone who is personally, actively helping is on Team Human. That means if you're a red hat wearing Trump supporter who volunteers at a soup kitchen every week, or you're a social worker with an Elizabeth Warren back tattoo, or a libertarian who carries a manifesto around in a plastic Walmart sack about how publicly funded stop signs are the moral equivalent of slavery, but you donate to the city mission every month, we're all on the same team. And we can have different methods and solutions and well-intentioned arguments to solve the problem we all want to solve, all right? Let's try to be pragmatic and kind about this. Let's be anti-Elizabethan. Finally, no sheep. If you own an apartment building and you've been thinking of dynamiting it and replacing it with a sheep pasture, you must promise me you will refrain. I've lost too many good men to sheep. All right. Does that sound good? We on board? All right, let's go. But first, the political orphanage and all of its time travel policy wonkery is made possible by the patrons who fund it. Listen, I'm happy to fit as many free carpoolers into my time-traveling 13-foot fiberglass camper as we can comfortably fit. Really, I understand not everybody wants to pay about a cup of coffee a week to make the show possible and get weekly bonus episodes like this week's episode where Brian Brushwood and I come up with a new alternate system opposed to the left-right spectrum based on how you react to change. But here's the thing. Plutonium is so expensive, you guys, particularly now with inflation. We don't want to be caught zipping through the time-space continuum on fumes. I'm not sure if you've ever run out of gas in the 14th century, but it sucks. Everybody's a witch. I'm a witch, you're a witch, your dog's a witch. Also, good luck getting a decent sandwich or competent dentistry. The last thing we want to do is run out of gas in the 14th century, trust me. So get ahead of the game and buy me some plutonium for my time-traveling fiberglass camper by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. I sure appreciate it because it keeps a bunch of unhinged Victorians from branding my ear and hanging me as an itinerant entertainer. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. Oh, and before I forget, thanks to everyone who came out to my book signing in Austin this last weekend. That was honestly one of the highlights of my professional career. Writing a book can be very thankless, so getting to read it for a full house, and it was a full house, and hear everybody's laughter and applause and get to meet listeners face to face, that was truly a gift. It really meant a lot to me. Thank you. Just so you know, it's not generally considered appropriate to throw your underwear on stage during a book reading, fellas. But all the same, deeply flattered. And hey, free underwear. So thanks, everybody. And if you want your own copy of my new book, Inappropriately Human, 21 Short Stories, which includes a funny time travel story, look for me on Amazon.com or go to mightyheaton.com/books. Thanks. All right, welcome back. Let's talk about some stupid and cruel programs we modern people do which prolong or exacerbate homelessness. Remember those Elizabethans we spoke about? At one point, they tried to solve poverty by effectively banning it. And here in the States, as late as the 19th century, New England towns would deal with homeless people by scaring them away with torture tactics. That, I don't care about solving it, I just don't want to look at it, mentality still persists. Cities all over America have vagrancy laws which outlaw loitering. We don't want homeless people pooling up in our park. We certainly don't want a tent village ossifying into a Hooverville, so we threaten to arrest them unless they move along. That's solving homelessness by dispersing it. If anything, it prolongs homelessness. When you arrest homeless people for loitering, they often lose their stuff, which sets them back, particularly if they lose their ID, which means they now have to go through the rigors of bureaucracy again, through a system they probably don't trust and actively fear. They go back to square one in terms of the various social services that they might be entitled to and benefit from that would help them get back on their feet again. A lot of the time, when cities ban loitering or camping, they will issue fines instead of jailing the indigent. But the indigent aren't going to pay those fines. They're not going to turn up to the court date either, which means bench warrants are eventually issued for their arrest. So someday, if they do manage to apply for a job or an apartment, that bench warrant is going to pop up and force them back into street poverty. So these measures are counterproductive. But that begs the question, so should we just let tent villages pop up in parks and in the middle of intersections? One of my friends here in Austin, I actually don't know her politics, but I'm pretty sure it includes the word flaming, felt unsafe entering and leaving her house at night due to a nearby tent village and people from it who would yell at her and have loud mental issues or be strung out on drugs. And I'm not a homeowner, but I understand why one would be nervous if they sunk all of their money into a mortgage, only to have the value of their biggest asset drop because property value declined as their neighborhood became swamped in tents. Safety and property value are legitimate concerns. What I'll say is this. Tent dispersal and vagrancy and loitering laws, when uncoupled with solutions, are cruel. Saying, we're going to break up that tent village in the park, and here is the alternative we've come up with, that is very different than saying, everybody get out of the park and get out of our city. Some other city can deal with you. We just don't want to see it. Those solutions, which we ought to couple with tent dispersal, are going to involve some combination of homeless shelters, increased funding for mental health services, public support housing at the municipal level, which we'll talk about here in a bit, and massively deregulating housing and zoning laws to lower prices overall. Incidentally, a major factor in tent cities is judicial. The reason that they've been springing up everywhere, in part, is judicial. In 2018, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in Martin v. City of Boise that cities cannot prohibit camping in public places unless there's an adequate alternate shelter available. What that means is if there are 2,000 homeless people in tents in your city, but only 1,000 available beds at homeless shelters, the city cannot by law break up the tent village. So legally, we have to provide something, shelters, dedicated housing, something, to break up the tent cities anyway. And we should have something. At the very least, cities with homeless populations should have a basic shelter capacity capable of temporarily housing people who would otherwise be on the street. And if you're looking for a good charity to start in your city, here's an idea for you. Most shelters won't let you bring your dog. For good reason. They don't know if your dog's been vaccinated or it has mange or it's dangerous. They don't know any of that stuff, so they won't let you bring it into a homeless shelter with a bunch of other people. If you want to go into the shelter, you generally have to let your dog go. Well, if I had a dog, I would rather live under a bridge than give it up to stay on a cot in a gym. And this is one of the many impediments there are to people just going into homeless shelters, one that we ought to have some corresponding charities for. There's an outstanding charity in Tulsa called Paws for Paws, which fosters dogs of homeless people and also folks in rehab. The dogs are theirs. They remain their dogs. The foster can't adopt the dog, but they'll take care of their dog for that person while they get back on their feet, or they spend a few nights in the shelter and get some rest, or go to rehab or whatever, to try and get some traction in life without having to worry about the fate of their dog. That dispersive impulse, that Elizabethan, I don't want to look at it, just get out of our way, dispersive impulse, is still alive and well. Certainly in regard to homeless shelters, at least. Via NIMBYism, not in my backyard-ism. And NIMBYism happens pretty much in every neighborhood in the United States. Case in point, Los Angeles. LA has lots of money to deal with its 80,000-person homeless population. Money isn't the problem. Los Angeles recently implemented a municipal sales tax, providing the city with more than $600 million explicitly to combat homelessness. That's about $20,000 per person, on top of a $1.2 billion municipal bond issued to construct 10,000 new housing units explicitly for people at risk of becoming homeless. Yet, Despite a budget of $20,000 per homeless person and a further $1 billion allocated to build low-income housing units, Los Angeles still has a sprawling, horrible skid row which could be its own mid-sized city. As of 2019, 80% of the proposed homeless shelters in Los Angeles have yet to be built due to red tape and permits and objections. It turns out you can't throw money at a problem if the money can't actually land anywhere. And even if Los Angeles does manage to sneak some construction in, it's going to cost more than necessary. According to a 2014 study by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, a quarter of the cost of building affordable houses goes to government fees, permits, and consulting companies. Back to NIMBYism, though. It turns out everybody likes the idea of homeless shelters, just not in their neighborhood. Because our neighborhood has some kind of special circumstance, aesthetics, walkability, property values. So you should build it in that other neighborhood over there, or that one over there, which feels the exact same way and which will also block that measure. NIMBYism is prevalent throughout the United States, and if you can figure out how to combat it, let me know, because it would solve a ton of problems. The only thing I've come up with is for cities to offer some kind of recompense to the residents for unwanted structures. We're going to build a homeless shelter in your neighborhood, but we're going to lower property taxes for everybody within 2 blocks of it to compensate, something like that. Boot-kicking NIMBYism would help a lot. But the good news is we could also reduce the need for shelters and affordable housing by using an even bigger boot kick to zoning laws. Here's where we turn from cruel practices to stupid practices. Remember all those dumb Elizabethans chopping down forests to raise sheep, which would raise the price of lumber and make housing more expensive? We have our own myriad stupid policies just like that, which are exacerbating homelessness. The single biggest factor in homelessness, follow me here, is lack of affordable housing. As I said earlier, there's a lot of factors at work, some of which we'll talk about later. Based on my research, about a quarter of the chronically homeless population has severe mental illness, which we can't fix merely through affordable housing alone. But most homeless people are transiently homeless, which is to say they will be staying on a couch or in their car or maybe at a shelter for a few months or a few weeks before finding a new stable living situation. For people who are otherwise functional, and that is most homeless people, lowering the cost of housing is the single biggest thing we can do to keep them in a house. Zillow, a real estate company, commissioned a study and found that homelessness rises once a city's average rent is 22% of median income, and it really spikes if it hits 32% or higher. So we can either figure out how to reduce the cost of housing, or we can build shelters and dedicated housing to try to catch the spillover. I'm going to contend it would be better just to figure out how to lower the cost of housing. I'm going to make the claim that a significant factor in homelessness, the single biggest economic factor, could be rectified simply by removing the current regime of stupid government housing, zoning, and rent control laws which limit supply and drive up prices. In Los Angeles, average rent is 49% of median income. Remember, there's a correlation of homelessness when rent hits 22%. LA is double that. So Los Angeles is pretty much doomed to have a homeless problem unless it figures out how to get more affordable housing. And so is the state of California, which has a severe and daunting lack of affordable housing. If you're not very familiar with economics, you might be tempted to say that houses in California are rising in price because of greed. Housing is expensive because of greedy landlords and greedy developers. So the government should pass laws to protect us from these cackling investors and their insatiable greed. But that greed hypothesis falls apart the second we apply even basic economic scrutiny. Are landlords in Oklahoma significantly less greedy than landlords in Los Angeles? Are all those evil Republican landlords in Houston less greedy than the Democratic landlords in San Francisco? When average rent drops in a neighborhood, as it did in many cities during the height of the pandemic when a lot of us fled to the suburbs, does anyone think, oh good, the landlords have become less greedy? Housing prices are a function of supply and demand. When demand goes up or supply goes down, housing prices rise. Conversely, if you build a bunch of new houses and apartment buildings, the supply increases and prices decline. Now, part of that demand is simply for location. People want to live in Manhattan more than they want to live in Placenta, Texas, or Vulva, Wisconsin, or Cleavage, Ohio. Actually, that last one sounds pretty good. But the government can and does further exacerbate that demand by artificially restricting the supply of housing through zoning regulations and rent control, both of which restrict the housing supply, thereby driving up prices. Los Angeles is a textbook example of this. Most of the developable real estate in Los Angeles is zoned for single-family homes. If you want to build an apartment complex, you legally can't. Instead of building something which can house 200 people, you can only build something which might accommodate 6. That drives up housing prices and forces the city to bubble out as sprawl. Massive, unending sprawl. Although LA did recently legalize accessory dwelling units, which is a step in the right direction. But there's still plenty of blame nationwide to spread around. Cities everywhere, even here in freedom-loving Texas, like to put up minimum lot sizes to zone away smaller, cheaper houses. The idea is, in our neighborhood, we want all the houses to be worth a minimum of $300,000. If you let somebody build 2 houses on that lot, they'd both go for $150,000. We don't want that. So we're going to use the power of the state to restrict what other people can do with their own private property in order to increase the value of ours, via minimum lot size. In other words, we are going to intentionally regulate this neighborhood with the goal of making it more expensive, which, stay with me here, leads to more expensive housing. It increases our property value and keeps out the riffraff, but it restricts the housing supply and thereby increases the cost of housing. New York City, which by one metric has the largest homeless population in the country and arguably the highest rent, similarly shot itself in the foot with zoning. At the beginning of the 20th century, New York City had about 130,000 single-room occupancies. Now, that's a little bit different than what we're talking about earlier. A single-room occupancy is different than a single-family occupancy. It's more like a dorm room or a hostel. A tenant would get a room in a building or a hotel, but share the bathroom and kitchen with other tenants. It was much cheaper to rent a single-room occupancy in an adult hostel than to rent your own full apartment in Manhattan. In 1955, New York altered its housing code to effectively prohibit the conversion or construction of single-room occupancy. While they technically weren't illegal, you couldn't make any new ones. So whenever a building got rebuilt or converted to something else, the single-room occupancy would disappear. They fell a number from 129,000 in 1960 to just 25,000 in 1978. I've lived in New York. It will not surprise you to learn that it's expensive. While having a room with no kitchen or bathroom in an adult hostel is a little too bohemian for most people, it would be a lot cheaper than having your own apartment, and much better than having to sleep in a homeless shelter. The abolition of single-room occupancies is an example of what I call the stepladder fallacy. Trademark Andrew Heaton, 2022. We look at the rungs on a ladder and observe that the lowest rung is disgusting and sad. So we say, that's horrible. Nobody should have to be on that disgusting rung like that. And we kick it into splinters. Then we look back at the ladder and say, well, that's much better. Nobody's on that disgusting old rung we abolished. Not realizing that all the people who would be on that rung are no longer on the ladder at all. They're in the ditch. It used to be common for people to have lodgers, wherein a couple or somebody with a spare room might rent it out to a young man or woman. I did this for a little bit when I lived in Oxford, England. I was the lodger of an ex-priest and his son over in Jericho. Whenever cities make restrictions on this sort of arrangement, homeowners just quit renting their spare bedroom. They're very fluid arrangements, and when you restrict it too much, it's just not worth the hassle anymore. Although Airbnb is kind of bringing that back on a commercial level, at least for travelers. Compounding zoning problems are Euclidean zoning ordinances. Quite possibly the most boring phrase I have ever uttered on this show. You know SimCity, where you zone for residential, commercial, and industrial? Euclidean zoning ordinances are basically that. They forbid mixing and matching different types of real estate. I hate them. There are all sorts of negative externalities from Euclidean zoning ordinances, not the least of which is a less walkable America, but they also make housing less affordable by making the market less fluid. Let's say you own a strip mall in Oubliette, Louisiana. There's a struggling video rental, a seedy CBD dispensary, a cell phone company you've never heard of, that sort of thing. And they can't make rent. Absent Euclidean zoning ordinances, You could rent out those properties as apartments, thereby expanding the housing supply. But legally, you cannot. So the law forces a neighborhood with inadequate housing to maintain a half-abandoned strip mall, and nobody wins. Remember the pandemic? That thing? In New York City, remote workers quit going into office buildings, which dropped in value by just shy of $30 billion. There were, and still are, empty commercial properties dropping their prices in hopes of attracting new businesses to scuttle in like hermit crabs. Meanwhile, there are thousands of homeless people who cannot find affordable housing, and millions of very stressed New Yorkers who would gladly spread out into those fallow office buildings, but that would be illegal. If you got rid of Euclidean zoning ordinances, you'd have a more fluid market and an immediate drop in housing prices. But New York historically goes the other way, hard, trying to combat housing prices by adding more regulations, ostensibly to protect people like me from evil, greedy landlords. New York has some of the strongest tenant rights in the country. It's incredibly difficult to evict a tenant in New York. You can't kick anyone out for rent delinquency during the height of summer or the depths of winter. If a tenant fails to pay for a month, but then pays the following month, it resets the clock on eviction proceedings. So you could, hypothetically, just pay a landlord every other month, and it would be incredibly difficult for them to ever evict you. So because every new tenant is a massive risk, landlords respond by requiring massive security deposits and lofty minimum income requirements. Most New York landlords require that you make a minimum annual income of 40 times your monthly rent. Thus, my father had to co-sign as a guarantor on my lease in New York, despite the fact that I was a 33-year-old man and an established primetime television writer with savings and excellent credit. The security deposit on my last apartment in New York City, a small one that I shared with 2 roommates, it was not luxury, was over $10,000. Over $10,000 for my last security deposit in New York City. It won't surprise you to learn that a lot of people on the edge of poverty don't have $10,000 sitting around. Conversely, when I moved to Texas, my security deposit was $300 because my landlord fully intended to evict me if I failed to pay rent for a month. And that was fine with me. Between paying higher rent and a massive deposit or getting evicted if I failed to pay lower rent, I, the tenant, strongly prefer weaker tenant rights. But there are more tenants than there are landlords, and landlords are an unpopular class, so politicians want to be seen fighting for us renters. Maybe you think strong tenancy rights are a good idea, and I see some advantages to them, but if you legally compel landlords to accept more financial risk, they are going to compensate by making it harder and more expensive to rent from them. But tenancy rights are only a minor speed bump in terms of New York housing prices. The real culprit is rent control. The idea with rent control is that landlords are greedy and trying to gouge you. So the government mandates a price ceiling that landlords cannot exceed in order to curb exploitation. Or that's the idea anyway. Remember Friends? I don't recall if they had a rent-controlled apartment or not, but they had to have had a rent-controlled apartment, right? There's no way a couple of waitresses and an actor could afford a beautiful 800-square-foot Manhattan high-rise apartment. Maybe if they were exchanging sexual favors with the mob, but there's absolutely no other way. Which sounds good, right? We like Friends. We want Joey to be able to afford a nice place in Manhattan. Shouldn't the government help out people like that instead of letting a cutthroat market hand their apartment over to a hedge fund manager while the cackling landlord pockets the difference? This is a great example of the seen and unseen in housing policy. What we see is several very attractive 20-somethings who luck out and get to live in an apartment they couldn't otherwise afford. What we don't see is all the new housing not being constructed, thereby increasing average rent because it's no longer profitable to build any. Here's what's actually happening. The city mandates rent control, forbidding landlords from charging above a certain threshold. Because the legal price is below market rates, landlords can't make any money, or they make far less, renting out apartments than renting out to businesses or doing something else with their money. So developers quit building new apartment complexes. Instead, they build commercial offices, which are unaffected by rent control. Actually, it's even worse than that, Because rent control laws are specifically designed to create affordable housing for people on the lower end of the economic spectrum, they rarely apply to luxury housing. So now developers only build upscale luxury housing because there's no way to make a buck on low-income housing due to rent control. In other words, rent control laws basically push developers to quit making low-income housing and only make high-income housing. Which makes sense. If rent control is too restrictive for me to turn a profit on building apartments, I'm not going to build new apartments. I'm going to build something more profitable instead. Why would a developer throw money away? Melbourne, Australia passed rent control laws during World War II, and not a single apartment building was constructed there until 9 years after the war, because it was unprofitable to build one. Egypt passed rent control in 1960, so people stopped investing in apartment buildings, leading to a housing shortage. When Santa Monica, California, which is a component city of the Los Angeles area, instituted price controls in 1979, building permits there declined by 90%. To put this another way, if you have rent controls, you effectively shrink the housing supply, but let people play the lottery inside of that smaller pool. So yes, there are going to be lottery winners like Jennifer Aniston and the guy that played Ross, who luck out and get a snazzy apartment they couldn't otherwise afford in Friends. And it will seem like a wonderful policy to them. What we won't see are the dozens of other sitcom characters who can't afford to pay rent and so instead become homeless. Also, having lived in New York City, I am not at all convinced that it's actually cute, deserving people who most benefit from these lotteries. Under Mayor Bloomberg, New York City tried to tackle affordable housing by mandating that all new buildings reserve X number of units for low-income people. The logic being, we'll ensure a percentage of all new housing is dedicated to poor people where they will live instead of on the streets. I met multiple people who applied for low-income housing when they were just out of their very expensive colleges and not technically employed yet, so they were legally poor because their income, upon moving to the city fresh out of college, was technically zero. Their application would sit in a drawer for a couple of years, by which time they're earning more money than I currently do, but the building would give them an affordable housing unit based off of their original paperwork because, they're our sort of people. We don't actually want poor people in the building, so we'll just subsidize art history majors from Westchester County. I know somebody who bought a house in upstate New York because they were saving so much money in Brooklyn through rent control. The Wall Street Journal found that the biggest beneficiaries of rent regulation in New York aren't low-income tenants. It's affluent, white, older Manhattanites. The Journal identified 18,500 New Yorkers benefiting from rent control, saving between $1,000 to $2,000 a month, who have medium household incomes between $150,000 and $210,000 per year. So in other words, New York's rental policies, and we can infer rent control in general elsewhere, are basically a scam to subsidize upper-middle-class white people on the Upper West Side who know how to game the system, which occasionally theoretically helps the odd Lisa Kudrow. Rent control also makes the housing market less fluid. Now I know market fluidity is only marginally less boring than Euclidean zoning ordinances, but I'm going to power through this anyway. Absent rent controls, people are more apt to adjust the size of their home to what they actually need throughout their life. A couple might need a 3-bedroom apartment when they have 2 kids, but when the kids move out, they don't really need that space anymore, and it's worth them to save the money and downsize to a smaller apartment. Under normal circumstances, that's what they would do. They would downsize to a 1-bedroom and save money, and a new family that needs that space would move into the 3-bedroom apartment. But if they've lucked out and they got one of those scarce rent-controlled apartments, why would you ever leave? According to one study, New York City has 175,000 apartments where one person occupies 4 or more rooms, mostly older people in rent-controlled apartments. In San Francisco, which also has robust rent control laws, a study found that 49% of its rent-controlled apartments had only one person living in them, which makes sense. If 1 bedroom and 4 bedrooms cost the same to me, why would I ever vacate my amazing 4-bedroom apartment in an expensive city? Thus, letting 4 other people move in. New York's annual apartment turnover rate is less than half of the national average. The proportion of people who live in the same apartment for 20 years is twice the national average. Again, the more housing you have, the more available bedrooms there are, the lower the price of housing. Now, if you got rid of those rent control laws, a lot of those sad bachelors in San Francisco would probably get a roommate. They'd be irritated, of course, but by splitting costs, both would pay lower rent. There would be one more bedroom open to prospective tenants. Housing prices would go down. I once spent a year in a windowless, converted pantry in Washington, D.C., just big enough for a desk and a futon. If that building had been rent-controlled, the existing roommates might not have bothered getting a fourth dude to live in what was effectively a walk-in closet. And if you're thinking, that's horrible, no one should have to live in a windowless pantry, that should be illegal. Okay, well, again, I draw your attention to the stepladder fallacy. If you had removed that option, I would not have suddenly magically transported into a nicer apartment of the same price. It's not like my friends captured me. When you abolish options, perfect options do not magically manifest to replace them. No, I would have simply had to pay more to live elsewhere or abandon the city altogether. A lot of other people would just become homeless. And between being homeless and living in the converted pantry of my friend Ben Brockschmidt's apartment, I marginally prefer the pantry. Marginally. And again, if you're thinking, well, then the government should have abolished living in pantries and imposed price controls. Well, if you do that, landlords would just build less apartment buildings. So as the population grows, the housing market would shrink, demand would increase, and then prices would too. And there would be a lot more homeless people. Remember, there's a direct correlation between rental prices and homelessness. So if the government is artificially jacking up prices, which it is definitely contributing to homelessness, which it is. The two cities with the most stringent rent control laws in the United States are San Francisco and New York City. And the two cities with the highest rent are San Francisco and New York City. And the top 5 cities with homelessness? San Francisco, New York City, San Jose, which is next door to San Francisco, Seattle, San Diego, and Los Angeles. Roughly half the homeless people in the entire United States live in California. Now, I imagine a lot of them are not from California, but have drifted there due to clement weather or have been pushed out by vagrancy laws in other states. So that's not all of California's fault. But California's housing prices, which are a major factor in homelessness, are definitely California's fault. Ditto New York housing prices with its labyrinth housing regulations which fly in the face of basic economics. Okay. So the government keeps making housing more expensive by regulating it. Why not cut out middlemen altogether? Why not have federally built, federally owned public housing? The government doesn't have to turn a profit, so it could just charge rent which working people on the cusp of poverty find affordable rather than the market rate. And because it would be creating housing rather than merely issuing price controls, it would be increasing the housing supply, right, Heaton? All right. I looked into this. It turns out we already tried that in the form of federal public housing, also known as housing projects, which are, from a public policy standpoint, a big, expensive failure. Fun fact, I used to live in a housing project. When I first moved to New York, I lived in Brooklyn on the corner of hipster and violent death. I lived in an apartment directly over a bodega, and I shared a paper-thin wall with a struggling band who had massively loud parties which started at least 4 days a week at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I sincerely hope, and I mean this, that every single member of that band is dead. Anyway, when the lease ran out on my apartment, I had to scramble. I hadn't been scooped up as a television writer yet, and I was working as a freelancer, which is to say I made probably $60 a week writing blog articles. I earned grocery money by working part-time as an assistant to an economist, and for payment, we would sneak into the Wall Street Journal on weekends and take all of the duplicate promotional books the big publishing houses had sent them for reviews. Then I would lug them all the way to the Strand bookstore, hawk that for cash, and go buy sandwiches. So I didn't have a lot of money for expensive New York rent, and I was panicking. I mentioned my predicament to my friend Reggie, who told me that he'd been staying at his aunt's apartment at a project in Brooklyn, but he was thinking about getting back together with his ex. So, if I'd like, I could just stay at his room at his aunt's place, and also his aunt didn't live there anyway, and it would only be $400 a month. Well, great. That was a deal. I mean, I saved money doing that. I lived there in the projects over the summer without air conditioning and refused to let my girlfriend visit me for safety reasons. I never had any problems personally, and I did save a lot of money. The weirdest thing, and I still can't explain this, is that whenever I went to the bathroom, All the lights in the apartment would go out the moment I had a bowel movement. It was baffling. For a while, I seriously thought maybe I have some kind of magic colon which can affect electromagnetic fields. I'm still baffled by that. Anyway, by illegally subletting that room from my friend, who was illegally subletting it from his cousin, who was living there in place of his aunt, who legally owned the lease but lived someplace nicer, I was taking part in a long-time experiment in public housing. Projects started in the United States in the 1930s when the government decided to bulldoze ugly old slums and herd the evicted people into new federal high-rises. The idea was, the slums are awful, so we will instead employ experts to design large, modern buildings for the poor to flourish in. Much like our forward-thinking friends over in the Soviet Union. So the government would locate a poor neighborhood, usually a black neighborhood, demolish it, disconnect all the existent neighbors from one another, flatten their businesses, hand over all that cleared land to white developers they could build their own stuff on, then erect a giant housing project for the dispossessed poor to move into. If the slum clearances had worked, and the urban poor exchanged their decrepit shanties to live in glittering utopian high-rises, that might have been a good deal. But that's not how it turned out. For example, in 1954 in St. Louis, the federal government built the Pruitt-Ego projects. The complex had 2,780 apartments, which is massive. Think about that. 2,780, that's like 2 blocks of a city. You can see pictures of it. It looks like its own bleak city. Fun fact, Pruitt-Ego used skip elevators, which stopped only at the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th floors, to encourage residents to use stairs. That would lessen congestion and encourage wholesome cardiovascular exercise. And I gotta say, intentionally designing a building to have the elevators not go to every floor is fairly emblematic of the federal government's competency at property management. The government massively overbuilt that structure to the point they never managed to fill it. The federal government isn't good at assessing supply and demand at a granular level, so it built way too many housing units, which meant the complex had inadequate money to pay for basic maintenance, which was part of the plan, so it began to fall apart. Pruitt-Ego became dilapidated, and muggers started hanging out in the stairwells between those skip elevators. By 1971, this veritable city of 2,780 apartments, this grand federal experiment in high-rise housing, was so horrible that only 600 people dared live in it. So, they blew it up. $57 million down the drain. Pruitt-Ego is the best-known example of these spectacular housing project failures, but it's emblematic of the entire enterprise. Projects have a reputation for attracting crime and suffering from horrific despair and maintenance issues. In effect, federal housing projects are very tall slums, except that they're taxpayer-funded. That's not horribly surprising to me because the government can't assess supply and demand as accurately or as quickly as a market can. It's much more blunt and unwieldy. And while I think the government should be involved in the issue of homelessness, and as we'll see, I'm in favor of increasing government spending in some fields, I see no real evidence that the government is by nature good at property management. And why would it be good at property management? That's not a government thing. In 2018, public housing residents in New York City sued the New York Housing Authority in federal court for failing to provide heat and hot water, keep residents safe from lead, and general dilapidation. And the court sided with them. I bring this up to say that just because we see a market failure in the private sector does not mean that kicking it over to the government will automatically be a better alternative. New York City has plenty of money and a decisive progressive majority in its governance, and as we've seen, very clear pro-tenancy perspectives. So if it's screwing up public housing, it's not because of lack of funding or tiny government folks like me holding them back. Now, to be fair, a number of people would contest what I've just said. They would say that my interpretation of Pruitt-Ego is anecdotal, and there are lots of other public housing that's good, and that I'm being very bourgeois, I don't know how you say that, bourgeois, and I'm stereotyping and sneering at poverty, and there are actually wonderful examples of public housing in this and other countries. So maybe the solution is not to scrap those projects, but just to fund them better and manage them more competently. Okay, let's accept that premise for a moment, forgetting that you can always claim a government program failed for lack of funding. You can literally say that about every single failed government program because they always request more than they get because of how life works. So literally every single failed government program, you could claim it only failed because of lack of funding, and that's an unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific statement. But acknowledging that, let's accept that premise. Great. We're going to erect a no-expense-spared public housing project called Sanders Ocasio Tower. And it's beautiful, and it's safe, it's gorgeous. There's a coffee shop at the bottom. Everybody likes it. It's good. Mission accomplished. The government completely succeeded in its goal. It's running a federal housing project that's wonderful. It's outdoing what you would have done with a sleazy landlord in the same part of town. Okay. Everybody who lives there, probably for decades, is never going to own a home because public housing precludes home ownership. It is by definition public and not private. And the single greatest vehicle for the accumulation of wealth in our country and its multi-generational transmission is through home ownership. And I'm saying this as an observer, not as a greedy capitalist. I don't own a house. And because of my income level as a podcaster and occasional comedian, I don't qualify for a mortgage big enough to cover purchasing a home in Austin, Texas, where I live. So I rent. I'm saying this as a renter. But I am saving up money to try and buy a house someday. I'm on course to do so in my 60s because long-term, the property would accumulate in value and it would be a good way to build up equity. And I would like to myself get on that homeowner train someday. Now think about the hundreds of thousands of black people in the United States who were forced out of their homes without their consent during the slum clearances and herded into federal projects. Yeah, they were living in shanty communities that weren't what we'd ideally like them to be, but imagine how much more wealth they would have had if they'd been building up equity for the last 3 generations instead of paying rent. I haven't checked New York real estate prices recently, but does property generally sell okay in Manhattan? How about Brooklyn? If you had a thing from 3 generations ago in Brooklyn right now, would it be worth a lot? I'm guessing so. Now, at this point of the program, there's a good chance you have a big question and addendum to everything I just said. Okay, Heaton, I believe you that zoning laws and rent control are driving up the price of housing. And if we got rid of them, there would be more housing and lower rent. Okay. But Heaton, people aren't just variables in math equations. Homelessness is not simply a function of housing prices. There are other factors at work. Addiction, trauma, mental health. Even if you freed that amazing invisible hand you're so enamored with to make more and cheaper houses, there are still going to be people who are, through no fault of their own, incapable of getting a foothold in the modern economy. So what about those people, those low-functioning people who will never earn enough money to get an apartment or a house? Even if we make apartments and houses cheaper through dezoning and whatnot, what do we do about them? That's a great point. One I agree with. As I said at the beginning of today's program, homelessness is a complex issue. So far, I've focused on eliminating the cruel and stupid things we're currently doing, rather than proffering alternate, proactive policies. Imagine we're at a bowling alley, and there's a bunch of debris and junk in the middle of the bowling lane, knocking balls into the gutter. Okay, fine. Yes, a sheep. Fine. That'll work for that. There's a sheep in the middle of the bowling lane. What we've been focusing on so far is just removing the debris. So there's a functional bowling lane where most bowling balls can operate. Get that sheep out of the way. Get people that could otherwise function in the normal economy able to function. But you raise a very good point. What about those balls that roll into the gutters anyway? Even when there's a functional bowling lane and auspicious lack of sheep, what do we do about people who can't find traction in the system, however broadly we endeavor to expand it? The federal government estimates that about 27% of homeless people are chronically homeless, whereas the remainder are transiently homeless. Many people who are transiently homeless can and will get back on their feet. Now, that's not to say we should just shout, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, blah, 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 invisible hand at them and move on, but that we can get them into the system and they don't have to be permanent wards of the state. For most people, we want to remove as many impediments as we can to getting them housed and employed and build on-ramps for them to do so. You know, hand up instead of a handout, that kind of thing. The remaining 27% of people who are chronically homeless are trickier. They may be unable to nudge their way back into normalcy due to trauma, addiction, mental health issues, or something else. And in those harder-to-handle cases, I think cities should build or purchase dedicated housing for the chronically homeless. I would be in favor of public housing at a municipal level in a targeted way. If I were a mayor or a city councilman, I would endeavor to determine how much of the homeless population is chronic as opposed to transient, then build about that many units of public housing, and then rely on homeless shelters for the majority of the transient homeless community, and then get rid of all the ridiculous zoning and rent control laws that are making housing expensive anyway, and that would keep a lot of people still in it rather than spilling over the edge. Salt Lake City is routinely cited as a municipal success story in dealing with homelessness, largely through their Housing First initiative. Housing First, broadly, means we're going to get you sorted with housing, then we'll worry about addiction and employment, as opposed to trying to solve addiction and employment first and dangling housing as a reward. In Salt Lake City, the government built multiple housing units and rents them out to chronically homeless people at a very subsidized rate, either 30% of their income or up to $50 a month, whichever is greater. A combined entity of nonprofits and government services allocate those flats based on need and if they think the person will be able to benefit from it and get along safely with the other tenants in the building. Salt Lake City's Housing First program does two very smart things. First, anybody involved in public services is put into a data tracking system which logs each time they enter a shelter, receive counseling, or get some other service from a government or nonprofit, which is incredibly useful. In a lot of other cities, there's no one case file which follows a homeless person. But with a tracking system, a social worker can see a person's history, spot patterns, make recommendations. Next, the housing in Salt Lake City has on-site counselors and social workers with a ratio of one caseworker for every 15 people, which is also smart, because we need more social workers. I, the tiny government guy parroting Thomas Sowell housing aphorisms in this episode, think cities or states should fund social workers more than they currently do. I now live in Austin, Texas, but for 6 months before I moved here, I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I volunteered under a bridge every Thursday, passing out hamburgers to homeless people through a wonderful charity called Nightlight Tulsa. I say passed out hamburgers, but they only let me do that a couple of times. Mostly I wandered around picking up trash with one of those hand-grabby things and putting it in a bucket, then seeing how many dogs I could pet. Or one time I got to run the library. In any case, there were a bunch of things to do, and if I was in Tulsa and it was a Thursday, I was probably under a bridge hanging out with homeless people. Nightlight Tulsa provides food and clothing to the homeless, but they're also very big on creating community and being friendly, and trying to get people emotionally connected. So I would, after picking up trash or slapping cheese on hamburgers or whatever, I would go grab a burger myself and awkwardly ask some scruffy guys at a folding table if I could sit with them, more or less like I used to do when I was the new guy at summer camp. And one of the things that I noticed over the last year in volunteering with homeless people is the profound informational disconnect between them and available services. Services are incredibly complicated, and there's really no way around this. They entail federal and state resources, varying county-level programs, and different local charities that alter from city to city. A homeless person might very well have aid available to them and not realize it. For example, one time I sat next to a very nice man in a plaid shirt and cowboy hat and cowboy boots who talked like this. Andrew, it's nice to meet you. My name's Rob. I don't remember what his name was. I'm a bull rider, but a bull kicked in my teeth, so I'm doing yard work for a guy here staying on his couch, saving up money for new teeth. We chatted for a minute, which was actually kind of adorable because we looked like we were in a Norman Rockwell painting, and I asked him, Rob, have you checked to see if there's a city service or a charity or anything that just gives out dentures to people? And he hadn't. So I walked over to a resource table and asked if anybody knew where we could find this guy dentures. And it turns out in Tulsa, Catholic Charities has a supply of dentures they give away. Probably not a great fit, but definitely better than gumming your food for months while saving up money for bespoke teeth. So I walked back and told Rob, if you'll speak to that nice lady over there at that table, they'll get you hooked up with Catholic Charities and maybe we'll get you some teeth. It simply hadn't occurred to him to ask anybody. Another time, I was seated at a table with a lady, we'll call her Meg, who was somewhere between her late 50s and 70s and had clearly had a hard life. And she started telling me a story about how her daughter and her son-in-law had signed her up for welfare money in her name and then taken it. They'd run a scam on her name. And I listened for a minute and I said, that's awful. Are you receiving Social Security money? And she went off on a tangent about how somebody else had screwed her over. So I said, well, that's horrible too. I'm very sorry that happened to you, Meg. Have you called the Social Security office? Because you might have Social Security money owed to you. And then she deflected and talked about another miscreant. And I said, did you pay taxable income to the federal government at some point? Because Social Security is computed based off that. So if you had a job for a while, and it sounds like you did, and it wasn't off the books, you might have money owed to you from the federal government that would help you out in your current situation. And what I basically realized after a while was that this lady had no idea how Social Security works. She wasn't sure what it was, and she was a little embarrassed by that, so rather than discussing the issue, she preferred to litanize grievances. Incidentally, these sorts of interactions make me skeptical of a city getting swamped by homeless people by virtue of establishing good services. I understand that fear that if a city is softer to homeless people and offers good services to them, that it will become a homeless beacon and get deluged. However, that idea is largely predicated on the notion that homeless people have a workable knowledge of the social services and public benefits available in various cities and migrate accordingly, which is contravened to my own experiences. I've not found that to be the case. Back to Rob and Meg, my friends that I hung with under the bridge. I am in no way trying to make fun of them. What I'm trying to point out is that educated people know how to utilize, if not take brazen advantage of, government services. To a lot of low information individuals, it's all a big, confusing morass of buzzwords. In the same way that I am baffled and exhausted by all the gobbledygook and complicated questions I had to fill out last week to get private health insurance, that feeling, a lot of homeless people have that same thing for just the myriad government services available to them. And on top of that, they may not trust the government because they feel screwed over by it, or because most of their interaction with the government is just cops telling them to move along. Plus, a lot of them don't have ID or a mailing address or a cell phone. Now, it's hard to get government benefits if you can't prove who you are. And it's hard to receive them if there's nowhere to mail a check to. And it's difficult to schedule appointments if you don't have a cell phone to make a call or send email with. A social worker's job is to know those various available programs and connect people to them. They bridge that informational disconnect. And while many charities can and do provide that role, we had a resource officer just sitting at a table underneath the bridge. I have to say, as a taxpayer, social workers strike me as a pretty effective use of my tax dollars, so I have no problem increasing their funding. I see a need for that on my end. Which brings us back to Salt Lake City. The social workers and the trackable databases are a great idea, but the meat and potatoes of their homeless program is that the government allocates supportive housing to the chronically homeless, and does so on a personal level, where a board sits down and makes an educated decision on who they think needs it and is most apt to benefit from it. Now, I'm going to make a peculiar claim here. As the Thomas Sowell acolyte, I think targeted municipal support housing is actually a fiscally conservative program. I think it makes sense financially for cities to invest in some amount of public housing and homeless shelters. And the reason I say this is homeless people are actually very expensive to taxpayers. The chronically homeless wind up disproportionately going to emergency rooms, getting arrested, interacting with cops, and going to prison. When Salt Lake City first started their Housing First initiative in 2004, the city estimated spending $61,000 annually on the chronically homeless, through shelters, emergency rooms, jails, and so forth. $61,000, which taxpayers are going to pay anyway, is actually plenty of money to not be homeless with. Conversely, they found that it only costs $16,000 per year to plug someone into supportive housing and hook them up with a counselor and a social worker. That's Salt Lake City, but you can run these numbers in any city you'd like, and you'll find much the same ratio. If you can get chronically homeless people into an apartment and out of trouble, they will cost taxpayers much, much less than the prison system will. Or if we better fund mental health services. According to a 2009 report from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, 20 to 25% of homeless people suffer from severe mental illness. In 2015, the Department of Urban Housing conducted the most extensive survey of homeless people in history, and they determined that a minimum of 25% of American homeless people are severely mentally ill, and a further 45% have some form of mental illness. None of which surprises me. Everyone I've spoken to on this subject assures me that if you're not mentally ill before you start living on the streets, you will be. Living without security or consistency, getting beaten up, sleeping poorly as you hear cars driving over you, getting ignored by everyone you try to say hello to, that is literally traumatizing. So it's not surprising to me that people would have mental health issues. Let's talk about booze for a moment, booze and drugs. Of course homeless people are drinking booze. Wouldn't you? During early lockdown, I once said screw it, and I drank 2 bottles of wine by myself while singing the entirety of My Fair Lady until the neighbors asked me to stop. I was materially comfortable during the beginning of the pandemic and the strict lockdown measures, but I still drank way more than I should have. I think most of us did. If I were living in a tent at an intersection and I was afraid of getting beaten up for sport, I'm pretty sure I would drink hard in that situation too. Anyway, I think it's fair to assume that about a quarter of the chronically homeless are severely mentally ill. If we can get them adequate care, they can potentially transition to stable housing and hopefully gainful employment, or at least being neutral within society. That means counseling services and publicly funded antipsychotic drugs. We can't ask homeless people to pay for their own antipsychotic medication because they're not going to be able to afford it. So there's got to be some mechanism in place to do that. If they're too deranged to make that transition, they are entirely unhinged from reality. It would seem to me to be a lot more humane to institutionalize them rather than wait for them to freeze to death or hurt somebody and go to prison. Institutionalization at a mental facility or a sanitarium would be safer and cheaper for everybody, voluntary or not, which I realize is a hot-button issue. If you haven't seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it's a fantastic film that I watched during lockdown while drinking 2 bottles of wine. One of the issues in the film is the notion of a sane person trapped in a nut house which won't release them, a system which we were horrified by and subsequently defunded in the 1970s and 1980s because it was horrible, as in naked, excrement-covered people sitting in corners shaking and screaming. I've seen some clips from documentaries about this. Back then, they were just warehouses of the damned. They were horrible. So largely for that reason, and because people were understandably worried about forcing the merely eccentric to remain against their will in an insane asylum, those facilities were eventually defunded, and Congress capped how many people can be in one at one time. I think we should re-expand sanitariums and institutionalize people again at a larger level than we're currently doing. But this time we have to make sure we don't just stuff crazy people into underfunded outhouses and forget about them. And we also have to deal with the rather sticky issue of the government declaring anyone mentally enfeebled and then locking them up against their wishes. And I totally understand the progressive and libertarian antipathy to the government locking up people against their will. I get that. I'm an Enlightenment kid. I swing by the Enlightenment every time I go time traveling, and I always enjoy myself. But Enlightenment philosophy and American individualism are predicated on the idea of rational adults pursuing their own voluntary self-interest. If you are deep in the throes of schizophrenia, you are not a rational adult. You're not a part of that rubric. If you're so far gone that you refuse to access free medication because the voices in your head are telling you it's the CIA trying to hack your brain, there's no way you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And at this point in my life, having now lived in a bunch of big cities, I have seen a lot of homeless people who are in truly horrible shape, just utterly incoherent, covered in filth, who are neurologically incapable of righting themselves. And if I ever got to that point, I would want somebody to institutionalize me or forcibly put me on medication. So it seems to me, either we let private charities and churches tranquilize and forcibly medicate the deranged, which seems like a pretty big can of worms to open, or we acknowledge that the severely mentally incompetent ought to be wards of the state. And I don't think increased mental health services and sanitariums would actually wind up costing taxpayers more in the long term. In fact, I think they would cost less. In 2001, the University of Pennsylvania analyzed 5,000 people in New York City suffering from mental illness, and they concluded that those people cost taxpayers an average of $40,500 a year through emergency rooms, psychiatric hospitals, shelters, and prisons. In 2006, Fred Markowitz wrote an article for Criminology wherein he looked at 81 U.S. cities and found a correlation between decreasing availability at psychiatric hospital beds and an increase in crime, arrest rates, and homelessness. Basically, people who are straight up nuts are apt to cause problems, expensive or dangerous problems if left untreated. Shortly after I moved to New York City, a homeless man suffering from schizophrenia shoved a bystander into the subway tracks. And there's horrible footage of this poor guy trying to claw his way out of the platform before a train strikes and kills him. The homeless guy was well known to the cops who knew he had a problem, and he killed that guy because the devil told him to. That's a situation where prevention would have been much better for all parties concerned. The largest public mental health service provider in my home state of Oklahoma is the Oklahoma penitentiary system. Prisons are expensive. Prevention, less so. Also, do we really want to be the kind of society that uses prisons as overflow for people suffering from mental illness? I don't want to be that. As a taxpayer, I would rather the government spend my money on mental health services and social workers than spend even more of my money on prisons. All right, I apologize, but we do have to go back to the issue of housing again, as it is fairly central to today's episode. As I said, I think it's a good idea and cost-effective for cities to purchase and allocate apartments to the chronically homeless. And it's very tempting to say, well, why not have the federal government do that on a massive level? Spend a few $1 billion and knock out homelessness altogether. Uncle Sam certainly has deeper pockets than Ricketts, Iowa, or Gleep, Nevada. I don't think you can solve chronic homelessness at the federal level. I don't think it's scalable. I think there's too much distance between the ground and the bureaucracy. The Rand Center for Housing and Homelessness in Los Angeles calculates that for the federal government to build sufficient affordable housing in major metropolitan areas would entail 3.5 million new units at the cost of $1.3 trillion. I think it would be better just to reduce housing prices by eliminating government idiocy and then working from there. Plus, I'm skeptical of the federal government's ability to pull that off. And while I think there's a need for temporary public housing to alleviate homelessness, I also think permanent public housing is basically a subsistence-level poverty trap. Although maybe I'm wrong about the federal government's involvement. Maybe you could have the federal government fund public housing, but pass that out via block grants to local authorities for their own temporary public housing. That could work. In 2021, the federal government spent $7.2 billion to combat homelessness, which actually isn't that much when you think about it, considering that it's homelessness. I mean, the feds hand out $4 billion in agricultural subsidies to sugar plantations every year, which is, by my books, needless and straight-up corrupt, cronyist bullshit. So maybe we could shuffle some of that sugar baron money over to the HUD. Although I should note, the Department of Housing and Urban Development already has a total budget of about $57 billion, although that goes to a bunch of other things that I haven't had time to parse out yet, which I suspect I would find counterproductive and inefficient. So maybe block grants. I think they already do that, but perhaps increase that in order for cities to get ahead of the curve on this. If the federal government were given a blank check to tackle homelessness, it would either build projects, which did not work well, or it would pass out housing vouchers and subsidies to whoever qualified. And that sounds great. However, keep in mind, it would almost immediately be dominated by upper-middle-class white people who know how to game the system. I think if we adopted an open-ended, we'll write a check to anyone who needs housing policy, you would find the smarmiest people you run into at airports would invariably qualify for subsidies they don't need. And pretty soon, the whole thing would turn into a scam for upper-middle-class white people and not really help poor people. As opposed to Salt Lake City, where a board of actual humans go over potential recipients of supportive housing and allocate those units based on need and potential. Again, might be a good place for federal blocks and federal funding, but I don't think it should be federally administered. I think cities would do well to get ahead of the curve and build or purchase some amount of dedicated public housing units. I would include a 3-year limit on them. 3 years to get social services, find a job, get drug counseling. 3 years to catch your breath and integrate back into society, which is the goal. And a time limit is not meant to be mean or to punish people here. It's because the goal is to save people from falling through the cracks where they will be traumatized and wind up dead or miserable or in prison. It's to facilitate their readmission into common society for the majority of people. And for the handful of people who will never be emotionally or mentally capable of getting a normal job or fully integrating into society, yeah, let's keep them in permanent public housing. Or if they require it, get them institutionalized into a sanitarium. For people who really need it, that is a part of the public safety net worth funding. For most people, however, we want things to be temporary. You want them to get back into society. You want them to have some skin in the game and a foot on that ladder. You can contrast that with New York City, where the median time tenants spend in public housing is 19.6 years. 10% of tenants in New York City live in public housing for 40 years. And again, anyone who's in public housing is not benefiting from home equity later on, so it's something of a trap. Okay, so in synopsis, wrapping up today's program, here's what I recommend to combat homelessness. Get rid of minimum lot sizes, single occupancy prescriptions, rent control, Euclidean zoning ordinances, or any other regulatory hindrances which drive up the cost of housing. That alone is going to make a major dent in the homeless population, where people will just be able to have houses on their own without special assistance. Increase funding for mental health services, sanitariums, and social workers. Build or purchase locally administered temporary public housing units and homeless shelters with the idea of getting people back on their feet, and those who can't get into a comfortable housing situation other than gutters and prisons. 2 final points before we go. First, I would like to be clear on this. I don't have a problem with paying more in taxes to keep people from living in destitution on the streets. I am happy to do that. I think most people don't mind paying a little bit more for fellow citizens not to live in squalor. My problem is if the government wastes my taxes or potentially uses them to accidentally immiserate people. So if on today's program you thought, wow, Heaton sure whinged a lot about housing policy and government idiocy, it's not because I'm reflexively opposed to taxes or funding worthwhile programs, quite the contrary. It's because I really do care about helping people, and top-down compulsory incompetency has a way of impeding that. And while I do think the government has a role to play in reducing homelessness, I don't think it can solve everything. In fact, I think there are a lot of issues, emotional, abstract, spiritual, which we can't solve merely by handing someone a key or a check. The government can potentially handle transactional relationships, but it can't love you. It can't give you purpose or a sense of community. And for a lot of people that are homeless, that lack of purpose, belonging, community, self-esteem, all of those issues are factoring into a lot of the problems that keep them homeless and traumatized and emotionally damaged. And those elements are beyond the remit of government. So on the next program, I'm going to speak with Alan Graham, who is the founder of Community First, which is an amazing operation here in Austin, Texas, which I think could be replicated throughout the United States and truly, truly brighten the lives of a lot of people who are currently suffering on the streets, without running afoul of any of the pitfalls I described earlier, and while also addressing those needs and abstract qualities that government can't really do. It's a very exciting, noble outfit, which I hope you will listen to, and I hope you will replicate in whatever city you find yourself in. So stick around. More good things to come. And thanks for subjecting yourself to over an hour of time travel, economics, and housing policy. Thanks. That's the show. Thanks for listening. If you want to support in-depth, research-heavy podcasts like this, please consider becoming a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. You guys make it all possible. I believe it was... Was that a sheep? Damn it, guys, the one thing I asked was to not screw around with sheep. Now they're everywhere. Which one of you ingrates disobeyed me and brought sheep into the podcast? Was it Eric? Eric, did you download sheep? How dare you? Anyway, thank you, Kevin MacLeod, who wrote Shades of Spring, used during the Patreon plug. And thank you, VIP Elite Orphans, who make this show possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.